The plant near London, Ontario, that makes electric vans for General Motors will no longer make them. The car company says it has stopped building the Bright Drop electric delivery van because demand has gone down. General Motors has officially stopped making one of its cars, which is another blow to Ontario's auto industry. General Motors is stopping manufacture of its Bright Drop electric delivery van in Ingersoll, which is another blow to Canada's auto industry. Sometimes, a quiet statement can hurt more than a loud public fight, especially when it comes to a community that has been through years of economic turmoil. When a company breaks promises that affect the future of whole families, the effects go far beyond just shutting down. It becomes a moment that makes a country choose what kind of place it wants to be, in an economy that is getting more and more unstable. It was a big deal that one facility in Ontario closed, and after the news got out, it was evident that the underlying story wasn't just about one plant. It was about a change in the country's identity, a change that would make people in North America uneasy and keep the attention of those watching what happened next. General Motors shut down more than one factory. It messed up the lives of those who had planned their futures on stable jobs that seemed safe just a few months before. The company made an announcement on October 21st, 2025, that felt like a chilly verdict. The Bright Drop building in Ingersoll would not be open again. The operations would not start up again. There wouldn't be a gradual switch to a new product, and there wouldn't be any work set up to replace it. Everything came to an end with a decision that came out of nowhere. The news disrupted the daily lives of more than 1,200 families. Workers who had spent a lot of time on the manufacturing floor suddenly lost money that helped them pay for their homes, their children's education, and their retirement plans. Many of them had worked at the plant before Bright Drop even existed, and before electric delivery vehicles were a big part of GM's public image. They had been coming for years, thinking they were part of an investment that would help Canada's economy in the future. Now they were unsure of how they would rebuild, and there was no assurance of success. Parents had to figure out how to talk about a situation they didn't want and couldn't stop. The folks who were affected did not regard this as a change in business. They thought it was a broken deal. The feeling of betrayal grew stronger because the plant had been touted as a key part of Canada's shift to modern manufacturing. GM had talked about making Ingersoll a big part of its electrified strategy with a lot of confidence. The corporation talked about Canadian talent, the relationship with the federal and provincial governments, and how Ottawa and Ontario gave billions of dollars to assist establish a long-term sector. The contract seemed to be the perfect fit for technology, jobs, and the country's goals. After then, the promises went away. Every time someone asked about the plant's future, GM's answer changed. The corporation said that demand was low, then called it a temporary pause, and then issued updates that didn't signify much. Even though the corporation had said earlier that production will start up again, it hadn't by 2025. The layoffs, which were first said to be temporary, turned permanent. The stillness that came after made things worse. GM didn't say much and didn't give a clear reason for its shift of direction. The trend was similar to a strategy that firms had adopted in Canada for a long time. Stay quiet long enough and hope the government reacts with the same lack of interest as it has in the past. A difference based on fear of losing more jobs. But this time, the response went in a very different direction. 3 days later, Canada said it had been getting ready for this moment long before GM knew what would happen if they walked away. The statement from Industry Minister Melanie Joly and Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne seemed calm at first. It didn't make any threats or use dramatic language, but in the area of trade policy, the phrase was a big stride forward. The letter said that GM and Stellantis' choices broke promises they made to Canadian workers and the Canadian government. Outside of the industry, the line didn't get much notice, but to executives all around North America, it was clear what it meant. Canada had turned on a system that was built for scenarios like this one. The government developed the auto remission framework months before. This mechanism was made to make sure that companies follow their duties without having to negotiate with politicians. It was clear what the idea was. Companies that kept their promises to make things in Canada could sell them without paying tariffs. People that broke their promises lost that edge. When the rule went into effect, GM lost over a quarter of its duty-free import quota right away. The effect was very bad. Any GM vehicle that came from a US factory and went to Canada suddenly had to pay a 25% tax. That meant that all crossovers, sedans, SUVs, and trucks that were going to Canadian dealerships were substantially more expensive. When the new penalty was added, the price of a car that cost about $45,000 went up to more than $56,000. No dealership could handle a disparity that big. No customer would agree to a price rise that big. Within hours, the financial effects reached GM's main office. Canada cut Stellantis' tariff-free import limit in half, which made things even worse for the company. The government told the corporation that it would have to do more if it kept failing to do its job in Canada. There were no impassioned speeches or televised fights to get the idea across. It was done by policy that had genuine power behind it. For years, companies thought that Canada would do everything to maintain car manufacturing within its borders. Fear of losing work affected many agreements. When businesses asked governments for more money, less red tape, or other incentives, they usually got what they wanted. This disparity often cost workers money. It was said that if Canada pushed back, there would be lower pay, less benefits, and plant closures. It looked like the country was stuck between needing money and not having any power. The things that happened in 2025 changed that. Canada made it clear that it will no longer be held hostage by threats from businesses. The architecture for auto remission didn't depend on feelings. It was based on rules that had been set up long before the fight started, and once the framework was turned on, it was clear how it should be used. Businesses got what it really meant. If a system like this existed, Canada wouldn't have to rely on negotiations to make sure people kept their promises. The outcome was controlled by a predictable structure. Getting into the Canadian car industry came with rules that were based on law, not politics. Now, it was the businesses that were unsure, not the government. Making this framework was one of the biggest changes in Canadian economic policy in a long time. It was a sign that people were moving away from old ideas about how Canada and big American manufacturers get along. The tariffs were just one portion of the growth. The real change came when Canada showed its strength in a way that hadn't been seen before. GM asked for immediate discussions with Canadian officials after the tariff adjustments went into effect. The corporation has ignored messages before, thinking there would be no significant effect. There was no more time for stillness. The financial forecasts were so bad that they had to be acted on right away. Jolie spoke with the officials of GM and made her expectations plain. The corporation has 15 days to give Ingersoll a concrete production plan, not just a vague pledge or a guarantee that may be changed later. Canada wanted to know more about the models, when they will be made, and that the plant would be added to the company's vehicle pipeline. If GM didn't deliver, the tariffs would stay in place forever. Other car companies paid attention. Ford stopped planning things internally to think about the long-term risks of not following Canadian rules. Stellantis changed the leadership in Canada and swiftly took steps to prove that they were willing to work together. Executives who thought Canada would always do what it took to keep jobs recognized that those ideas were no longer true. For workers, the change meant more than just trade calculations and tariff tables. It meant that the government was willing to defend the businesses that helped communities all around the country. It meant that the manufacturing sector finally had someone who could stand up to companies that had been threatening to move jobs for decades. It meant that their jobs were safer than they had been before. 3 weeks later, GM's position had turned into a case study. A business that used to see Canada as a good place to make things suddenly had to think about how much it would cost to break its promises. The system that Canada set up didn't depend on political cycles. It didn't depend on short-lived fury. It worked according to rules that didn't change to make things easier for businesses. The change in policy gave families in Ingersoll a sense of recognition. Their work was very essential to one of Canada's biggest industries, and for the first time in a long time, the government showed that it was willing to use force to protect these jobs. People who worked in fields that weren't directly tied to this also paid attention, knowing that it could affect how future discussions went in the energy, aerospace, technology, and pharmaceutical industries. The next part of the fight was over the 15-day time frame. GM had to come up with a detailed strategy that could be put into action. The corporation had to make clear how many products it will make and when. It had to explain how the Ingersoll facility will fit into the company's overall EV strategy and show that the promises made before were not empty. If GM did what they were told, the tariffs would be looked at again. If not, the punishments would last forever. Permanent tariffs of that size would have an impact on supply chains, dealership operations, and the choices consumers make across North America. The stakes were much higher than just one corporation. The choice would show how multinationals will work in Canada in the future. The story started with the closing of a factory and finished with a message about national authority. It was distributed to every boardroom and said that access to Canadian markets will depend on justice, responsibility, and respect for workers. The framework made sure that such requirements had to be followed. They were not optional. Without a doubt, the country carried out such enforcement. Also, Trump's trade conflict is pushing Canada toward a country it used to be careful with, and that change is happening faster than most people in Washington thought it would. Not long ago, it would have seemed inconceivable for the leaders of Canada and China to stand together and grin. The arrest of Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver and the imprisonment of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor in China marked the beginning of one of the darkest times in the relationship between the two nations. That standoff made people not trust each other, which looked like it would never go away, and for years the couple had to deal with that. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, met with Xi Jinping on the margins of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in South Korea. Their 40-minute talk was the first encounter between leaders in 8 years and showed that both sides were open to trying something new. The Canadian statement called the meeting a turning point and said that both sides were interested in strengthening economic ties. It also said that Carney will continue the conversation by going to China. As Canada fought China over canola and electric cars, its fight with Washington got worse. Trump and Carney's talks seemed to be going well until they were stopped by a controversial anti-tariff ad from the Ontario government. Trump stopped discussions again, leaving Canada in yet another precarious situation. Because the United States was still Ottawa's most important trading partner, this disruption put the city in a more dangerous situation. Canada was in danger of getting stuck between two economic heavyweights as tensions rose on both sides. People in Ottawa started to think differently because of that. Experts said that Canada's attitude toward China changed a lot in the last few months. Lynette from the University of Toronto said there was a complete change of course that had to happen. She witnessed policymakers trying to change the whole framework of the partnership, not because of philosophy, but because they needed to survive in a volatile global market. Political voices supported that change. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who has been one of Trump's strongest detractors in Canada for a long time, advocated for a more stable relationship with China. Beijing, knowing what was going on, said it would be willing to lower canola tariffs if Canada got rid of its electric vehicle levy. The message made it seem like China was open to making deals that would help both sides at a time when Canada needed help. Public opinion has its own unanticipated effect. Polls showed that Canadians were now more likely to see the United States as a possible danger than China. People still had a lot of unpleasant things to say about China, but the change showed how frustrated many people were as the trade war with Washington got worse. People were seeing Canadian businesses fail and were starting to wonder if long-term partnerships still gave enough safety. Some experts said that Canada's approach was more about being practical than about making a symbolic change. Fen Hampson of Carleton University said that when a key export market becomes unstable and punitive, countries naturally look for other options. The idea is not to trust blindly, but to diversify in a smart way. Still, the way forward has its own perils. If Ottawa strengthens its connections with China, it might make things worse with Washington. This is something that Ottawa needs to think very carefully. To make these decisions, you need to be patient, clear-headed, and stable. Canada is in the middle of a geopolitical puzzle with pieces that don't always fit together well. This is because alliances are changing and new economic realities are settling in. It's a time when every choice has effects that can last for decades, and the result will affect the next chapter of North American power. The leaders of both countries now have to deal with the same question. Leadership has to cope with a problem that is like a Rubik's Cube.